Welcome to Morbidology. I'm your host, Emily G. Thompson, author of Unsolved Child Murders, Cults Uncovered, Mysteries Uncovered, and co-author of Unsolved Murders, True Crime Cases Uncovered. Join Morbidology on Patreon for exclusive episodes of Morbidology Plus, exclusive merch, ad-free and early release episodes, and much more. Pittsfield is located right in the heart of the Berkshires in Massachusetts. While it's the largest city in Berkshire County, the city has a real laid-back atmosphere. In 2011, Pittsfield was hit hard by Hurricane Irene, and in the aftermath, it was noticed that three well-known men, two of whom were vulnerable, had vanished from their apartment. Suspicion would immediately be aroused, and these suspicions would only intensify when it was discovered that one of the men was scheduled to testify against a high-ranking member of the Hells Angels. Three men who called Pittsfield home were 44-year-old David Glasser, 58-year-old Edward Frampton, and 47-year-old Robert Chadwell. David and Edward lived together in an apartment on Linden Street. Robert was one of the men's best friends, and often spent times at the apartment. He just lived a couple of doors down. David's friend Rick Reynolds would recollect how he and David had shared a love of music, and they would often get together to jam. Rick would play the drums while David played the guitar. While David loved rock music, he also played gospel at AME Zion Church, located on the same street where he lived. Another friend, Donna Randolph, said that David was very well liked in the community, adding that he had probably known half of the people in Pittsfield. See, David was well known because he was a handyman, often doing odd jobs for his neighbours and others around the town. He was a very generous man, and while he didn't have much money, he always made sure to purchase gifts for his friends and their children. In 2005, David had written a letter to the editor of the Eagle newspaper in a bid to spark awareness of how people treat one another. He described himself as mentally and physically challenged in the letter, but as his doctor, Dr. Barry Lubofkis, said, he was a man who had overcome challenges and hardships to stand up tall. He was completely estranged from his family, but there was one woman, Donna Randolph, who looked too like his mother. Edward, who lived with David, had attended Belcherstown State School, which was a state-run school for people with developmental disabilities. He was sent here when he was just 5 years old, and stayed there on and off until he was in his 20s. According to his former teacher, Jim Morrissey, much like David, Edward too had overcome some challenges in his life. He said that while Edward had some developmental disabilities, he never should have been institutionalised. And as he said, he seemed to have no family connections. Edward was a good athlete. He had participated in the school's basketball programme and had even taken part in the Special Olympics. He always wanted to help others, and in 2006 he became a massive advocate for those like himself, those with developmental disabilities. He would give lectures to new staff members at Individual Resources, which was a non-profit human services agency for developmentally disabled people with autism. He would speak to them about his experiences at Belcherstown State School in order to help the new staff understand the needs of those that they would be taking care of. Di Donna, who was the agency's human rights coordinator, said that Edward was always amazing at his lectures, and each member of staff would leave his lecture feeling moved by his stories. He always made sure to tell them that they needed to treat people they were caring for with compassion and respect. She described Edward as courageous, humble, and very humorous. Edward and David were roommates, and their other friend Robert was always checking in on them and hanging out at their home. Robert had grown up on the west side of Pittsfield. He was a keen outdoors man, and he was the father of one girl, Ashley. His sister, Chadwell Farley, described him as a happy-go-lucky man who was always there to help anybody out if they ever needed it. Robert didn't bother anybody. He was well known and well liked, she said. On the night of the 27th of August 2011, Tropical Storm Irene hit New England. The men would typically hang out around their apartment, but over the course of the next few days following the storm, David, Edward and Robert were nowhere to be seen. People became concerned. There were family members who tried to get in contact with them. Erin Forbrush, who was Edward's caseworker at ServiceNet, which provides services to those with developmental disabilities, spoke to him almost every day on the phone. When Erin didn't hear from Edward, she went over to the apartment. She knocked on the front door and received no reply. She walked round to the back of the apartment and saw that the television was on and David's truck was in the driveway. She returned later with her co-worker, Heather Ethier. They noticed that the back door was open, but there was nobody inside. A missing person report would be filed and police would begin their search for the three men, focusing on the neighbourhood and the Pittsfield State Forest. Inside the apartment, they found the men's cell phones and medications, and a search of their credit and debit cards showed that there had been no transactions. According to a neighbour, she had heard loud banging on the front door sometime after midnight on the 28th of August. She then heard raised voices coming from inside shortly thereafter. Suspicions were immediately aroused. It's peculiar enough for one person to disappear, but for three men, two of whom lived in the same apartment, it was unheard of. Robert's brother, Les Chaswell, said to the Berkshire Eagle, 3 people, all in the same house, missing. Yeah, something happened, something tragic. We'll never hear from them again, and you can quote me on that. What made the disappearances even more suspicious was the fact that David had been scheduled to testify that same month in the trial of Adam Lee Hall, who was the third in command of the Berkshire Hells Angels. Hall had pleaded not guilty to a plethora of charges, including kidnapping, assault, witness intimidation, extortion, cocaine distribution and weapons crimes, and he was going to stand trial. He'd been freed on bail, but just days after the 3 men vanished, he was arrested on extortion and child pornography charges. In that case, he had allegedly forced a 16-year-old girl to send him a nude photograph of herself. David and Hall had earlier had an altercation. Hall believed that David had stolen an automobile part from him back in 2009. Hall responded by luring David to his home in Peru, where he beat him with a baseball bat. Hall then forced David to hand over his car before threatening to kill him if he ever went to police. David reported Hall to the police, and Hall, in turn, tried to frame David. He had hoped that in framing David, it would stop him from testifying against him during his upcoming trial. He attempted to frame David by getting a woman he knew to accuse him of robbing her at gunpoint. Hall had anticipated that this would cast doubt on David as a witness. The ruse failed and David's charges were dismissed. Hall was now behind bars on unrelated charges, while David, Edward and Robert still remained missing. Hall's defence attorney, William Rhoda, stated that his client denied all of the allegations against him and knew nothing about the disappearances of the 3 men. Defence Edward stated, I would not be surprised with the authorities to suspect Hall's involvement, but I have no reason to suspect that it's true. Just a couple of days later, however, there was a massive breakthrough in the case when it was announced that 3 bodies had been found. They were dismembered and stuffed into garbage bags and then found on a private property on Woodmere Road in Beckett. They had been buried and then covered with boulders. An excavator needed to be brought in to remove large boulders as well as a 6-foot-long slab of rock. It was somewhat of an intricate crime scene. Trenches had been made for runoff liquid, and investigators said that it was filled primarily with water, but there were also globules of fatty substances which had come from the 3 dismembered bodies. The 3 bodies would be identified as David, Edward and Robert, with Berkshire District Attorney David Capeless stating, "This is the end of the search for David Glasser, Edward Frampton and Robert Chadwell, but it's also the beginning of our efforts to bring justice to those who are responsible for their deaths." It would be determined that the 3 men had sustained several gunshot wounds, stab wounds and slashing wounds. Due to the horrific condition of the 3 victims, identification couldn't be made by sight alone. They were identified via fingerprints and clothing that was found inside some of the garbage bags, alongside the remains. There were socks with Edward's name tag sewn on the inside. Most of the damage to the bones had been caused by hacking or chopping trauma, and some kind of heavy-bladed instrument had been used. Cuts on their bodies were consistent with a large butcher knife, a meat cleaver, or a machete. The news of the discovery devastated the men's family and friends. At the same time it was announced that 3 bodies had been found, it was also announced that 3 men had been arrested and charged with the murders.
I'm announcing that we have discovered the remains of the 3 missing men, David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell. We have also charged 3 other men with their murders and kidnapping, and all 3 of those men are in custody and will be arraigned in Central Berkshire District Court here in Pittsfield tomorrow morning. The 3 charged are Adam Lee Hall, 34 years old, of Peru in Pittsfield, David Shalou, 44 years old, of Springfield in North Adams, and Caius Viovis, formerly known as Roy Gutfinski, 31 years old, of Pittsfield. They are each charged with 3 counts of murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and 3 counts of intimidation of a witness. We have also obtained search warrants for and have secured 5 locations and 2 motor vehicles, and we will be carefully processing each of those places for evidence of these crimes. We have discovered a burial site where the remains of the 3 men were hidden. We are presently in the process of completing the recovery of those remains. The remains will be removed to the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner in Boston for complete autopsy examination and for positive identification. But based upon the information that we have so far, sadly, I am confident that our worst fears for David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell have been realized.
The men were identified as 34-year-old Adam Hall, the Hells Angel mentioned earlier, 44-year-old David Shalou, and 31-year-old Caius Viovis. They were each charged with murder, kidnapping, and intimidation of a witness. According to the probable cause report, Hall and his 2 acquaintances had killed the 3 men, and they were motivated to do so to prevent David from testifying during his upcoming trial. It read in part, Hall has repeatedly demonstrated in the past his propensity for resorting to extortion, intimidation, false charges, and the planting of evidence and/or violence in order to avoid prosecution for his crimes. The report also alleged that in a bid to avoid prison in the case involving David, Hall had met with the FBI back in September of 2010, and he offered to help them take down a number of East Coast chapters of the Hells Angels, which included the one in Berkshire County. Ironically, the chapter in Berkshire County had posted their clubhouse as collateral for a $250,000 bail for Hall just the year beforehand. Hall said to the FBI that he would be able to help them take down the chapters by wearing a wire and then providing them information on drug dealings, firearm sellings, and other crimes that he said the gang were involved in. The report continued. The FBI declined to work with him in that capacity, fearing that he was uncontrollable and much too dangerous. Furthermore, investigators had found a number of witnesses that told them that before David, Edward, and Robert vanished, they had heard Hall talking about how he wanted David to disappear before the trial so that he couldn't testify. Then there were more witnesses who heard Hall speak about the 3 men being taken after the 3 men had vanished. Additionally, there were more witnesses investigators had spoken to that saw a man matching Hall's description, throwing shoes and some other items from a bridge in Lenox shortly after investigators had gotten into the missing men's apartment to search. Then one of these witnesses identified Hall as the suspicious man at the bridge from a police lineup. The 3 men appeared in court where they all entered not guilty pleas and were ordered to be held without bail. Outside of court, a number of locals congregated and chatted about the case. Tasha Persip, who was Robert's cousin, said, "You're used to seeing stuff like this in big cities, not here. Innocent people got killed who had nothing to do with it." As photographs from the court hearing swept across social media and the news, many were taken aback by the appearance of one of the suspects, Caius Viovis. He was covered in tattoos, and while that in itself isn't unusual, he also had 2 rows of horns that had been implanted into his forehead, alongside a tattoo of the number 666 in the middle. Smoking Gun posted an article which included his mugshot, along with the caption, "Easily the scariest mugshot of an accused murderer. Much like Hall, Veovis had quite the colourful criminal history. When he was just 13 years old, he was arrested for the first time for carrying a knife. He served time at a juvenile detention facility where he told staff that a nun had called him a psycho and evil and had told him that he would grow up to be a murderer. In 2000, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for assaulting a teenage girl in a motel room. The attack was part of a ritualistic blood-drinking ceremony with Veovis's girlfriend at the time. During the trial, the teenage girl testified that Veovis and his then 17-year-old girlfriend had taken her to a hotel room and slashed her back with a razor. Veovis and his girlfriend, Deanne Jones, then drank her blood while kissing one another. Police were informed of the attack when the teenage girl went to the hospital and required 32 stitches. Veovis and Jones would be ordered to stand trial for the attack, and he was portrayed by the prosecution as being a goth who practiced self-harm. According to the prosecution, Veovis fancied himself as a worshipper of Satan. He had told police that he was a vampire who drank blood, including his own and others. Both Veovis and Jones were convicted of elevated aggravated assault and reckless conduct. While awaiting sentencing, Veovis slashed his arms in jail, and it took 200 stitches to close the wounds. In that case, Veovis would be sentenced to 10 years in prison, with all but 3 years of that sentence suspended. He was also handed 4 years probation. This meant that after serving those 3 years, Veovis was released from prison. In 2008, Veovis had been charged with kidnapping and drug possession after he and another man were arrested in New Bedford, Massachusetts, after holding 2 dancers from a local strip club hostage in a hotel room. Veovis and the other man stripped the women of their clothing, started to take cocaine and refused to let them leave. The women managed to contact police. The kidnapping charges were dropped, but Veovis would be incarcerated in Maine on the probation violation charge. He served 3 years and was released from prison in April of 2011. He was then discharged from probation 3 months later. Case Veovis was not actually his real name. Veovis had been born Roy C. Graffinsky, and in 2008 he legally changed it. Before this, he had attempted to change his name to Disade Trash Horror. In the petition, he described himself as a religious Satanist. He wrote, "I wish to shed all ties with the Christian Church, and one important step towards that goal is legally changing my name." When his name was successfully changed later, he had written in the petition, "Adopted as a child, I have no blood relation, nor do I share the nationality my given name implies. It has long been a burden for me, and I feel the new name I have carefully and with much thought chosen more justly represents my individuality and nationality. This name is also keeping with my religious beliefs." Veovis had seemingly picked the new name to blend in with his aesthetic, and after he was arrested, a number of media outlets highlighted the fact that Caius is the name of a vampire in the movie Twilight. Veovis actually wrote a letter to the Eagle newspaper in which he lambasted the media for suggesting his name had come from the Twilight movies. He wrote, "Pop culture inspires me to vomit hot blood. I have never seen this silly movie, nor have I read the books, nor would I ever, even now, waste my time with such useless drivel." He explained that his full name, which was Caius Domitius Veovis, had been inspired by the Roman emperors Caligula and Nero and an ancient Etruscan demon. He also wrote, "I would like to express my sincere condolences to the families involved in this tragic case. The deceased are not the only victims here." But he didn't elaborate on what he meant by the final comment about the deceased not being the only victims. David Chalou, the third suspect, also had a criminal record. In March of 2011, he stood trial alongside Ronald Kogut for trying to extort money from a man whose dog had bitten Kogut. They had been charged with armed assault with intent to rob, assault with a dangerous weapon, extortion by threat of injury, and also threatening to commit a crime. However, both men were acquitted. Chalou was a member of the Aryan Brotherhood, which is a white supremacy neo-Nazi prison gang and organised crime syndicate. Shortly after the arrests of the 3 men, there was a 4th arrest. 62-year-old David Casey was arrested for allegedly helping Hall, Chalou and Veovis dispose of the bodies of David, Edward and Robert. He was charged with accessory after the fact of murder, kidnapping, and intimidation of a witness and was ordered to be held on $1 million bail. Early the following month, the triple murder case was sent before a grand jury. Hall, Veovis and Chalou were indicted on 3 counts of murder, kidnapping and witness intimidation, while Casey was indicted on accessory to murder, kidnapping and witness intimidation. All 3 men would subsequently appear in court where they pleaded not guilty to the charges against them. Details of the murder would come out in court. On the night of the 28th of August, Hall, Veovis and Chalou went to David and Edward's apartment on Linden Street. David, Edward and Robert were inside the apartment. They had planned on abducting and murdering David, but since Edward and Robert were there, they too were abducted. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the 3 defendants didn't want any witnesses. Casey would also plead not guilty to his role in the case. According to his defence lawyer, Robert Fuser, Casey was terrified of jail. He said that his client had been forced by Hall to help bury the 3 victims. He was ordered to use an excavator to bury David, Edward and Robert, and Hall would actually be charged with an additional count of witness intimidation because of this. The property where David, Edward and Robert were found was owned by a man named Daniel Cole. Now, Daniel had nothing to do with the murders. He had actually hired a contractor to clear some land on the property where the 3 bodies were found just days before the murder. He had stumps removed, an embankment dug out, and he was turning woods into lawn. Now, the man he had hired to do this was Casey, who had then used his excavator to help bury the bodies. On the 28th of November, on what would have been David's 45th birthday, he was laid to rest. A memorial service was held at the Prince Memorial AME Zion Church on Linden Street, where David had played gospel during his life. Around 40 people came to pay their final respects to the unassuming man. The service was led by Reverend William Durant, who described David as unpretentious and a friend to many. He spoke about all the years of volunteer work that David had done and the friends he had picked up along the way, stating, "He felt good about his life, and for that, we all have to say amen." Throughout the service, David's cremated remains sat at the front of the church in a black urn with a gold-coloured rose emblem on the front. Alongside it, there were 2 candles and a picture of David. The Reverend wasn't shy about speaking of the violent manner in which David was taken from the world, calling his murder tragic, vile, and heinous. Afterwards, David's loved ones gathered at the Christian Centre, where they remembered David as the kind of man who would do anything anybody ever asked for him, never asking for something in return. Edward and Robert had already had their funerals by this point and had been buried, but these were private. In the wake of the arrest, many questions were raised in regards to how Hall was free. He had a number of prior charges and he was a high-ranking member of the Hells Angels. The Berkshire District Attorney's Office would receive much criticism. District Attorney David Capeless would defend his office, telling the media that they were diligent in the handling of the earlier cases. It would be discovered, in fact, that the District Attorney's Office had dismissed or failed to pursue 10 violent charges against Hall before he beat David with the baseball bat and attempted to frame him for robbery. These 10 violent charges were between the years of 1997 and 2006. Only 2 of the charges against Hall ever stuck, and he served just 1 year in jail for assault and battery in 1997. According to District Attorney Capeless, cases were dropped against Hall because witnesses wouldn't cooperate, and then in other instances, prosecutors sought jail time on lesser charges. Some of the earlier charges handed down to Hall included stabbings, beatings, and kidnappings. In one of these cases, a man who had been scheduled to testify against Hall was badly beaten outside of a bar. Despite the fact that David had been beaten with a baseball bat by Hall, he was still willing to testify. Even after the beating with the baseball bat, Hall was arrested and released on bail twice. With such a violent history and with a history of threatening and harming David, who was a prosecution witness, why wasn't bail ever denied for Hall? Why wasn't Hall behind bars? Many questions would also be raised regarding the protection of David. He was set to testify as a prosecution witness against a high-ranking member of the Hells Angels. Why wasn't there more protection in place for the vulnerable man? Well, according to District Attorney Capeless, they had twice relocated David, but each time he wanted to return home. He said, "In retrospect, could there have been more done? Of course, everyone connected with this case regrets horribly what happened, but we cannot force people to take protection." Hall had been on the wrong side of the law for years. He was known to threaten and intimidate witnesses and even beat them, yet time and time again he was allowed to stay on the street, let go with a little more than a slap on the wrist. Meanwhile, the case was proceeding through the justice system and preparing to head to trial. There was a delay in September of 2012 when Hall's defence lawyer, William Rhoda, requested that he be withdrawn from the case. While in court, Hall said that he believed that a breach of trust existed between him and his defence lawyer, and they weren't sure how to proceed. He additionally said that he didn't trust any Berkshire County lawyer to handle his case, and requested that he be given 2 defence lawyers, one that would handle the murder case and one that would handle the other cases. Hall made a comment to a photographer in attendance, telling them, "Rhoda is trying to sandbag me. I've known him for 20 years. The request to withdraw was approved. It would be revealed that he had requested to withdraw because Hall had compromised his defence strategy by meeting with police twice to try and exonerate himself. In doing so, Hall revealed his defence strategy. In approving the request to withdraw, Superior Court Judge Agostini wrote, "Hall has totally disregarded Rhoda's advice on fundamental issues and spoken at length without representation with the Commonwealth, the party that is seeking to convict him of unspeakable crimes." It had been discovered that Hall had met with investigators who were seeking to convict him twice on the 9th of August and then again on the 13th of August. These interviews had been videotaped and they lasted more than 6 hours. In the interviews, Hall disclosed his defence's strategy and said he did not trust his defense lawyer. Hall's new defense lawyer would be Alan Black, and the change would set the case back. It still hadn't been decided whether the men would be standing trial together or separately. In February of 2013, District Attorney Capeless would file a motion requesting that Hall, Veovis and Shalhoub stand trial together. In his request, he wrote that the murders were part of a single plan or scheme, and also cited judicial economy. Meanwhile, Hall's defence lawyer would request that the trial be moved out of the county due to the pre-trial publicity, which he said would impair the ability to get a fair trial. As it was being decided whether the trial would move, Hall wrote a letter to the Eagle newspaper. He claimed that he had been falsely charged with the 3 murders, and also claimed that he had not attempted to become an FBI informant. He wrote, "I'm innocent and I can prove it," but he never elaborated on how he could prove it. In reference to his co-defendants, he wrote, "I can't believe they're holding my friends. That's a crime." He went on to tell the newspaper that he was a Mormon and had visions, but he denied that this was going to be a ploy for an insanity defence, stating, "I was visited by spirits when I was a kid and they told me to wash myself in the Mormon church." Speaking of the visions, Hall claimed he was visited by Fly Smith, a Cherokee chief who died in 1838 due to the Trail of Tears, which was part of the Indian removal between 1830 and 1850. He also claimed he was visited by Joseph Smith, the founder of the Mormon Church, and said that he was a descendant of both men. It would be decided that Hall, Veovis and Shalhoub would stand trial together, and the judge would set a tentative date for early 2014. During the hearing, the defence teams for Veovis and Shalhoub argued that there was not enough evidence against their clients to send them to trial. They filed motions to dismiss the cases against them. They argued that no evidence had been presented to the grand jury to prove that there had been an actual kidnapping. They also argued that the prosecution did not yet know the location where the murder had taken place, and they had not recovered any murder weapons. District Attorney Capeless rebutted the defence attorneys, stating that a plethora of evidence existed to show that the murders had taken place in Berkshire County, that a kidnapping had taken place, and also evidence which showed that Hall and Shalhoub were at the crime scene. He did acknowledge, however, that the evidence against Veiovis was mostly circumstantial, but nevertheless he claimed that they had a strong case against him too. He had been seen with Hall and Chalou before and after the kidnapping and murder took place. He revealed that he was also captured doing counter-surveillance of the district attorney's office during the time that David, Edward and Robert were missing, and that he'd been seen looking at saws and axes in Home Depot before the murders. Judge Jeffrey Kinder would refuse to throw out the charges, stating that the defence team had failed to bear the heavy burden of proving the integrity of the grand jury process was impaired. This meant that the trial would be proceeding in January of 2014. However, in October, District Attorney Capeless would reverse his stance on having the three suspects tried together. He said that new evidence had been uncovered and he wanted to try the three suspects separately. It would be decided that Hall would be standing trial first, but Judge Kinder would approve the request for the trial to be moved from Berkshire County. He cited sensational media reports tainting the pool of jurors as the reason to have it moved. His trial would be moved to Springfield. Hall's murder trial began on the 12th of January 2014. It had been over 2 years since the murders, and still, very few details of the murders had made it into the media. The trial would, of course, change that. According to investigators, on the night of the abductions and murders, Hall had been arranged to leave his car near the site where the three bodies would be buried. After dropping off his car, he was seen leaving in Veiovis's car. He was then seen by several witnesses as he disposed of evidence in a river. Chalou and Hall then took Hall's car to a local junk dealer the day after the murders, and it was crushed. The motivation behind the murders was to prevent David from testifying against Hall in his upcoming trial. During opening statements, District Attorney Capeless described the disturbing nature of the murders. He said the jury would hear that Hall had used words such as gutted, torture and cutting when he spoke about what he had done to David, Edward and Robert. Hall had told people that he forced David to watch him murder his two best friends before he too was killed. He even said to him, "I told you what would happen if you witnessed against me." District Attorney Capeless said, "This defendant didn't learn the most important thing. That most important thing," he said, was that his accomplices and confidants were going to testify against him.
They cut them, that they tortured them. He talked about how he made him watch, and also talked about how you should have seen the look on his face. The bodies were dismembered. Each of the three men's heads, arms, and legs were cut off, and that the torsos of David Glasser and Ed Frampton were cut in half in the middle.
District Attorney Capeless said that perhaps the most terrifying testimony was going to come from David Casey, who was accused of helping dispose of the victims. Casey was going to tell the courtroom that Hall was holding David and went to shoot him. However, the gun didn't go off. David ran. Hall told Casey that another person fired a shot at David, but Hall shouted, "He's mine," and shot David in the head, but not before making him plead for his life. Not only did David need to watch his two friends be killed, he almost got a shot at freedom, but it was ripped away from him.
And then he told them how, after they had cut David Glasser's head off, he held it up, laughed and made jokes about how ugly he looked. He said while all this was going on, it was raining really hard. He loved doing this in the rain.
He said that Casey would tell the jury that Hall held David's dismembered head up after cutting it off and laughed and joked before commenting that he was ugly. Speaking of the gruesome crime scene, the district attorney told the courtroom that when the bodies were unearthed, there were 15 garbage bags of remains, and these included the heads, arms and legs cut off all three men. The torsos of David and Edward were cut in half. David had sustained 3 gunshot wounds, Edward had sustained 4 gunshot wounds, and he and Robert had been cut through the middle, with their organs exposed. Defence lawyer Alan Black, on the other hand, told the jury that there was no evidence linking his client to the murders. Speaking about the witnesses who were scheduled to testify against his client, he said, "Most have been charged with either cases relating to this or have other charges." The first witness to be called to testify was Aaron Forbush, a social worker who'd worked with Edward and knew David. She spoke about the difficult life Edward had endured, his time at Belcherstown State Hospital. Some others testified about the last time they had seen the victims, the day before Hurricane Irene hit. Willie Haywood Jr., who described himself as Robert's lover, said that he had spoken with him on the phone at 11:20 p.m, just hours before the murder. He told the courtroom, "He told me he loved me, he missed me, and he'd see me soon." Two former girlfriends of Hall would testify against him. Nicole Brooks said she had found herself mixed up in the murders when Hall told her he planned on framing David to prevent him from testifying against him. But when that didn't work, he told her he would need to make David disappear. It had actually been Nicole who'd filed the false police report against David, claiming that he robbed her. The alleged robbery was somewhat convincing, with Hall taking Nicole to a rest stop in New York. Here, he shot into a tree several times so that the bullet holes would confirm her story. Investigators in that case, however, quickly determined that the entire robbery was fabricated by Hall. A second former girlfriend, Brittany Beggs, told the jury that Hall had told her he was going to beat up David for selling auto parts that he claimed were his. She was actually there when the beating took place. She said that Hall had hit David with a baseball bat and then stole his truck. In that case, Hall had actually learned later that somebody had given David permission to scrap the items from his garage. He hadn't stolen them at all. Testimony would then be heard in relation to Hall's relationship with Veovis and Chalou. Alexandra Erie, Hall's girlfriend at the time, and Rose Dawson, a friend of Hall and Alexandra, told the courtroom that the night after the murders, they were all at a Hells Angels clubhouse in Lee. Chalou and Hall got quite drunk and Hall began to run away, saying, "Help me, help me." Chalou was making a gun motion with his hand, before Hall said something along the lines of, "You should have seen the look on his face. You should have seen him run and try to get away." According to the prosecution, they were joking about the 3 murders that they had just committed. They also testified that Hall had given them very wet money and asked them to get bleach and wash their hands after handling the money. While at a store, Hall called them up and said he didn't need the bleach anymore. When they arrived at Hall's home, they found Hall, Chalou and Veovis. All 3 seemed tired and Hall seemed jumpy. People testified that Hall, Veovis and Chalou were together a lot in the weeks leading up to the murders. Alison Scarce, who had also been in a relationship with Hall, told the jury that the day before the murders, she had seen Hall removing 3 handguns from inside a large bag of dog food at Veovis's apartment. She described Veovis's apartment as creepy. She said that there was blood spattered on the walls and human skulls. There were also others who testified about 3 guns inside his apartment. There were others who said that Hall had tried to get them to frame David. Caitlin Carman said Hall told her to go and hang out with David, get drunk and then claim that he raped her. She said no, and Hall asked her if she knew anybody else who would be willing to do it. She also said that the day before the murder she had been with Hall, Veovis and Chalou, and they began complaining about David. Veovis and Chalou told Hall not to worry, that they were going to get him. Karen Sutton would also tell the jury that Hall had confessed to the murder to her. He told her that in David's apartment, Edward was fixing the computer while David and Robert were playing video games. He described Edward and Robert as collateral damage. The key witness for the trial was David Casey. He knew Hall through business, having done some excavation work at the Hells Angels clubhouse in Lee and at Hall's home. He claimed that he was forced to help bury the 3 victims, and that Hall had threatened to harm him, his girlfriend, his sister, and his sister's boyfriend if he didn't comply. Speaking about the murders, Casey said that on the 28th of August, Hall told him that he, Veovis and Chalou killed David, Edward and Robert. He referred to the 3 men respectively as the retard, the fat guy, and the N-word. He said that Hall told him he was holding David by the hair when the gun misfired. David managed to get himself free and run into the woods. He ordered somebody to go and get David. This person, he wasn't sure who it was, caught up with David, shot him, but didn't kill him. He said that Hall was angry because he wanted to be the one to kill David, which he was. He told David that he warned him what would happen if he testified against him. David begged for his life and he promised not to testify, but Hall ignored his pleas and shot him dead. According to Casey, Hall had told him that the men stabbed Edward while he was on the ground and left him for dead. However, they later found him slumped against a tree and moaning for help. Hall then stabbed him again. Hall also joked that it was hard to cut up Robert because he was a little larger, and said that one of the co-defendants really enjoyed torturing and cutting the victims up. Hall also told Casey that he had chopped David's head off, held it up by the hair, and then joked about how ugly he looked. He also said that Hall had told him he was very satisfied with the murderers, and went home and slept like a baby. At the time, Casey had been doing some excavation work on Daniel Cole's property, where the bodies would ultimately be found. The plan was for Casey to meet Hall at an acquaintance property, where Hall had left a car with the bodies stuffed inside it. At the property, Hall introduced Casey to Chalou. He told him he was in the Aryan Brotherhood, and said that you need to murder somebody to gain membership. Hall opened up the truck where the dismembered bodies were, and commented that they were starting to smell. They then drove the car with the bodies to Cole's property, where Casey dug the hole. He told the courtroom it was more or less like a trench. He told District Attorney Capeless, "When I was digging the hole, I wondered whether I was going to go into it too." Hall then threw between 6 and 8 garbage bags into the excavator bucket, and Casey dumped the bags into the hole and covered it over. Testimony would then be presented in regards to the injuries that were inflicted on David, Edward and Robert. Dr. Jennifer Hammers had been the pathologist to conduct their autopsies, and she told the jury that she couldn't tell whether the dozens of gunshot wounds, stabbing wounds or cutting wounds had been inflicted on the victims before or after death. Due to the fact that they had been dismembered and were significantly decomposed, it made it difficult to reach a determination. She also couldn't say for sure if one particular injury was fatal, or whether their deaths had been a culmination of all the injuries. Photographs of the injuries would be circulated to the jury. Defence Black had requested that the graphic photographs not be displayed in the courtroom. Dr. Hammers then detailed each of the injuries. Robert had a gunshot wound to his cheek and 2 gunshot wounds to the torso. He had 2 stab wounds to the neck, 2 shallow stab wounds to the wrist, a blunt force injury to the chin, which had fractured his jaw in several places, and rib fractures. She described a cutting injury from the pubic region up to the bottom of the rib cage. It went into the abdominal cavity. There were also injuries, but these were superficial. Edward had 5 gunshot wounds. There was 1 to the left cheek, 1 to the back of the left shoulder, and 3 to the arms. He had been stabbed 3 times in the jawline and once in the neck. There was also a wound to his chin and other wounds to the shoulder and torso. He had also sustained a deep horizontal wound to the upper back. It went through skin and muscle and then cut the spinal cord. There was a wound to the lower back as well as a wound to the left thigh. Much like Robert, Edward had sustained a wound from the pelvic area to the base of the ribs. David had been shot a total of 3 times. 1 went through the ear and into the head. 1 went into the left jaw, and 1 went into the thigh. He had been stabbed 3 times in the back. 2 were 2 inches deep, while the other 1 was deeper. David also had a laceration to his elbow, and on the top of his head, there were 3 soft hemorrhages, with bleeding underneath the scalp, which was consistent with being struck with some kind of blunt object. Dr. James Pekins, a forensic anthropologist, would testify about the injuries to the victim's bones and the dismemberment. It was revealed a book had been found in Veovis's apartment, which was about dissection. Illustrations of dismemberment from the book had been cut out and formed a collage found in Veovis's apartment. Dr. Pekins would confirm that the dismemberment of the men was consistent with what was shown in the illustrations. In Veovis's apartment, investigators had also found a machete, knives, a cat o' nine tails, a meat cleaver, 2 baseball bats with rows of nails in them. As mentioned earlier in the episode, Hall took his car to be crushed. Well, Henry Sayers from Sayers Auto Wrecking and Jason Hassan, who worked in the salvage yard, would testify. They told the jury that Hall frequently brought in scrap metal and would be paid per weight. He came in on the 29th of August with a Buick. The dashboard had been completely stripped apart. The interior was drenching wet and the carpet inside the back seat and inside the trunk had been stripped. According to Casey, this was the car that was used to transport the 3 victims. With all of the evidence presented, it was now time for closing arguments. Hall never testified on his own behalf. In closing arguments, District Attorney Capeless said that Hall had an obsession with trying to keep David from testifying against him. The others, he said, were killed simply to eliminate witnesses. As he spoke, Hall had an outburst, claiming that he had an alibi.
Over there at the house on Sunday afternoon to meet with you.
20 miles away at a barbecue.
The colleague will say no more during the remainder of the closing argument. You may proceed, Mr. Bates.
And most important, those records and analysis of them and the test drive together also corroborate that the defendant was at the scene of the burial on Monday morning.
Defence Black said to the jury that there was no physical evidence to link Hall to the murders. The jury would return with a verdict. They found Adam Lee Hall guilty of 3 counts of murder, as well as kidnapping and intimidating a witness. Following the verdict, Robert's sister, Carol Chadwell Smith, said, "I hope nobody has to endure the pain that we have." The mandatory sentence for a first-degree murder conviction in Massachusetts is life in prison without parole. At the sentencing phase, Judge Kinder said, "Over the course of years, David Glasser was stalked, intimidated, beaten, framed, abducted, murdered and mutilated. His friends Edward Frampton and Robert Chadwell were shot, stabbed, dismembered, simply because they had a misfortune of being there when Mr. Glasser was abducted." He went on to say that David had a developmental disability that made him particularly vulnerable, adding that Hall deserved no more mercy or consideration than he had shown his victims. Erin Forbrush, Edward's caseworker at Service Net, provided a victim impact statement. She had known both Edward and David, and she said, "I am grateful to have been given the opportunity to get to know Edward Frampton and David Glasser, victims of an atrocious and senseless crime. Ed enjoyed talking with others, had a fun yet quirky sense of humour, which brought joy to most people he encountered. Ed was someone who liked to take care of others. Ed's death leaves a very personal loss for all who loved him and to those that were touched by Ed's love and humour. But on a much larger advocacy, educational scale, Ed's death also leaves a gap in the understanding of the early disability world." State Trooper William Scott spoke for himself and the others in law enforcement who had worked tirelessly on the case on behalf of David. He said, "Many people would say his life was simple, but it was his life to live the way he needed." He said that David always made sure to help people, whoever needed a ride. When Hall stole his truck, he asked the police for help, and when they retrieved it for him, he was extremely grateful. Hall would be sentenced to 3 life sentences. With Hall beginning his prison sentence, it was now time for David Chalou to stand trial. District Attorney Capeless would sum up the case, telling the jury that Chalou had bragged about the murders to 4 separate inmates and threatened he would do the same to somebody else. Some of those who would testify in relation to this were members of the Aryan Brotherhood. When Chalou found out that one of these men, Jeffrey Cashman, was going to testify against him, he threatened to kill him. The men would tell the courtroom that Chalou had bragged about torturing David, Edward and Robert. He told other inmates that they had been beaten, cut up while still alive, and had a slow death. Many of the people who testified during Hall's trial would testify once again, including Casey, who said he believed that when Hall was talking about the moment that David momentarily escaped, he said, "Davy got to him real quick," as in David Chalou. Another witness, who was Chalou's ex-girlfriend, told the jury that she had seen Chalou throwing items from a bridge into water the day after the murder. He would also be identified as being with Hall when he took the Buick to be scrapped. Much like Hall, David Chalou would also be found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder.
Premeditation with malice aforethought. Mr. Foreman, was this the verdict of the jury?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, was this your verdict?
Yes.
And was this verdict unanimous?
Yes.
You, the jury, further find that your guilty verdict of murder in the first degree is also based upon a theory of extreme atrocity or cruelty. Was this the verdict of the jury, Mr. Foreman?
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, was this your verdict?
Yes.
And was this verdict unanimous?
Yes.
He too was handed 3 life sentences. Caius Feovis would be standing trial next. His defence lawyer, James Radern Jr., would announce beforehand that he was concerned about his client's unique appearance. He feared that it would make it difficult for him to get a fair trial. The prosecution during this trial would claim that Veovis had become involved with the murder plan shortly before it took place, and would allege that he had taken part so that he could join the Hells Angels. They admitted that there was no physical evidence connecting Veovis to the murders. After the murders, there had been surveillance on a Hells Angel party, and police saw Veovis there with Hall and Shalhoub. There were others who saw the three men together, and that Veovis had mentioned that they were going to get David. Witnesses also said that the three men were together the day after the murders, and that Hall was seen getting into Veovis's Jeep after dropping the Buick, which had contained the victims' dismembered bodies, at a house before taking it to be scrapped. The defence would reiterate that there was no physical evidence connecting Veovis to the three murders. Nevertheless, K.S. Veovis would be found guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The jury had deliberated for 30 hours. When the verdict was read aloud, Veovis shouted, "I'll see you all in hell." During his sentencing phase, he professed his innocence.
Let me make this clear one more time before I sit down. My hand was not in this, all right? My hand wasn't in this. But if anybody thinks I'm going to hang my head today and beg for mercy, they're just as deluded in their thinking as that jury of my peers who convicted me of this.
He said that a plea deal had broken down between himself and the district attorney's office, and alleged that investigators on the case and prosecutors admitted that they knew he wasn't involved in the murders, and wanted to squeeze him for information. This was something that the district attorney's office completely denied. Much like his co-defendants, he too was sentenced to 3 life terms without the possibility of parole. David Casey, the star witness, pleaded guilty to 3 counts of accessory after the fact of murder. He was sentenced to time served. He had served close to 1,000 days. On the night of the 28th of October 2011, Hurricane Irene was tearing through New England. Unbeknownst to the 3 victims, something else was brewing that night. Something dangerous. When Adam Lee Hall discovered that he couldn't silence David Glasser with his threats, he decided that more violent action needed to be taken. Enlisting his 2 friends, K.S. Veovis and David Shalhoub, they committed one of the most vicious crimes that the area had ever seen. Not only would David Glasser pay the ultimate price for somebody else's crimes, but also his 2 best friends, Edward Frampton and Robert Chadwell, who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening. I'd like to take a second to say a massive thank you to my new Patreon supporters, Sarah and Holly. I'm genuinely grateful for your support. The support on Patreon really helps the show out. If you'd like to join, the link is in the show notes. In exchange for your support, I send out a handwritten thank you note as well as some exclusive merch. You also get ad-free and early release episodes, exclusive episodes of Morbidology Plus, and behind the scenes. I'd also like to thank my hosting platform, Spreaker. I'm on their Prime program, and their dynamic adverts seriously help Morbidology continue. If you're a podcaster or a future podcaster, seriously look into Spreaker Prime for your host. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read our true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.